All right, good afternoon. I think we can slowly get started. My name is Nir Isakovich. I'm the director of the Applied Ethics Center here at UMass Boston. And this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have Michael Lynch from the University of Connecticut. Michael is a professor of philosophy at UConn and the director of the Humanities Institute there, and he's the executive director of the New England Humanities Consortium. His work focuses on truth, democracy, public discourse, and the ethics of technology. Michael is the author or editor of 7 books, including The Internet of Us, Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data, In Praise of Reason, Why Rationality Matters for Democracies, Truth is One in Many, and the New York Times Sunday Book Review editor's pick, True to Life. He's the recipient of the Medal for Research Excellence from the University of Connecticut College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and he's the principal investigator for Humility and Conviction in Public Life, a $7 million project aimed at understanding and encouraging meaningful public discourse funded by the Templeton Foundation and UConn. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times Stone weblog, and his work has been profiled in The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and Wired, among many others. He speaks regularly to both academic and non-academic audiences and has appeared at such venues as TED, the Nantucket Project, Chattanooga, and South by Southwest. Also, this morning he was just named Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor at UConn, so congratulations for that, Michael. And we even gave him an excuse to get out of the Board of Trustees meeting earlier than he otherwise would be able to. So with that, I will hand it over to Michael. Michael, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much.
Take it away.
Thanks so much for coming out on this beautiful, beautiful April day. So in December 2016, a man by the name of Edgar Welch walked into a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., armed with an assault rifle. He was there to self-investigate a bizarre conspiracy theory alleging that there was a child sex trafficking ring perpetrated by Hillary Clinton and other Democratic politicians happening in the basement of that very pizzeria. Mr. Welch was astonished to find out that the story was actually completely absurdly false. Not only was there no child sex trafficking ring happening in the basement of that pizzeria, there wasn't even a basement. As Mr. Welch would later say to the New York Times, the intel on this one wasn't 100%. Now, the bizarre conspiracy theory that caused Mr. Welch to engage in this sort of Chuck Norris act in Washington, D.C. a couple years ago is one example of what we used to call fake news. That is, stories that are fabricated and spread online and off, made to look like real news stories, and spread for their purposes of fun, profit, and political gain and manipulation. Now, a couple of remarks about that. First, you might have known what we used to call fake news, because I should note that while I still, and will in a moment, I'll make some distinctions, being a philosopher, still will call this fake news, these sort of stories. You may have noticed that the term fake news now in the United States has, and elsewhere actually in English, has changed its meaning somewhat. It's become, I would say, strictly speaking, ambiguous. And the other meaning of the term, very popular, is something like this. Fake news is whatever news stories I don't like. All right? So it is that is something we should be aware of right from the get-go. I am not going to be talking about fake news in that sense. I'm going to be talking about it in its old-fashioned sense, you know, the way it was used in 2015, back in the day when the world was different. And in that sense, fake news is just one kind of species of a broader phenomenon we could call information pollution, where information pollution roughly is toxic information that's dumped into the media environment. Where by toxic, I mean information that is either deliberately, intentionally false, misleading, or just not based on sufficient evidence, that is mistaken, mistaken because because it's not based on evidence, or good evidence, or just information that is simply not based on any evidence at all, good or bad, which we might think of as rumors as being a kind of information like that. So there's a lot to talk about, and many of you here I know a lot, in fact more than I do, about the kinds of information pollution. But I am actually interested today in that kind that I talked about right at the beginning, that deliberately created news stories created to be, that are in fact known by the creator, if there is one, if it's an actual person, as opposed to algorithm, to be false. That is, deliberately deceitful false content masquerading as journalism spread for profit and or political gain. So I'm going to ask two questions about this phenomenon, this kind of information pollution. First, why does it spread so effectively on social media? Why does it spread so effectively on social media? First question. Second question, why are appeals to facts and reasons and evidence not very effective in countering it? Okay, so two questions for today. Why does this fake news spread on social media? And why are appeals to facts, reasons, and evidence and the like not particularly effective in countering it? Now note that the usual answers to these questions, and there are lots of answers, these are, as we know, the questions of the moment in a way. So there's lots of work, including by some of you here, on these questions. And the usual answers, the ones that I've given myself, for example, particularly to the question of why it spreads so much on the internet, that's question one, is the usual answers appeal to facts about, for example, the polluters, that is, to their uses of troll farms or robots and sock puppets. So that's a kind of information pollution. To run with the analogy, one way to try to figure out why it spreads so fast on the internet is to say, well, look at the devices the polluters use. They use troll farms, they use professionals, they use sock puppets and robots, all sorts of mechanisms to spread these fake news stories online and, in fact, off. And that, of course, has got to be part of the explanation. It spreads effectively because there are effective means of spreading it used by the people who are making up these sorts of stories. The second part of that usual explanation says, well, yeah, but that's not the whole explanation. There's also, we also got to factor in the users of social media's gullibility, right? The fact that people who use social media, none of the people here in this room, of course, I'm not talking about any of us, right? We use social media, but in a responsible way. We all know that, right? We're not talking about this special room here with special people. But the second half of this explanation is that, look, people are gullible. People lack critical thinking. They are subject to confirmation bias. They're subject to tribalism of various sorts. So if you put those two together, why is it that this disinformation and misinformation spreads on the internet so quickly? Well, somebody says, look, facts about the people doing the spreading and facts about the people who are sucking up that information. Not a mystery. I think this explanation so far, the usual explanation, is perfectly fine as far as it goes. But I think while it does a good job of explaining why it is that information of this information pollution of this kind spreads so quickly on the internet, it doesn't do a great job of explaining the second question I asked, which is why are reasons and facts seemingly so ineffective in combating such pollution? It goes partway there, especially if you add in psychological phenomena that sometimes goes under the title the Backfire Effect. This is a set of psychological studies, now highly contested, that purported to show that if you wanted to, say, convince somebody that, let's say, climate change was real, somebody who doubted climate change, and you gave them some facts that, according to the backfire effect, roughly speaking, I'm summarizing a whole bunch of data and studies, roughly speaking, the claim was it seemed to show that giving people facts actually just made them dig in more. They became more convinced that climate change was a hoax and you were trying to pull something over them with your science. Okay? Now, as I just alluded to, actually, the work on the backfire effects, as some of you may know, is now very much in dispute. Some of the original studies are now being openly questioned. There's issues of replication, all sorts of things going on. But even if that explanation was part of the explanation for why facts aren't useful, I don't think it would have solved the whole question, because nobody who claimed that the backfire effect exists, the people who've claimed it, the psychologists, they never meant it to be a sort of general explanation for why no one ever changes their mind about anything. Because A, people do change their minds, right? And people do actually respond to evidence. So it's not as if that was meant to be this sort of general explanation that was covering all cases and would explain everything. There is going to be no such explanation in this case or most other cases regarding psychology. But I just wanted to flag that for a variety of reasons, we can go more into this in discussions, I'm not satisfied with the explanation so far. I think we need an additional supplementary explanation to give an effective and useful answer to the questions that I asked. Why does fake news spread so quickly, and why are the appeals to facts seemingly so ineffective? And I think in order to give that explanation, it will be helpful to stop and pause for a minute and think more deeply about the kind of communication that we engage in when we share news stories online. So what I'm interested now, and I'm going to now take you on this journey to try to investigate the kind of communicative acts that we're actually engaging in when we're sharing news posts online. All right. So now, time for further distinctions. I'm going to call a news post in the rest of the talk any post that we make on a social media platform which contains information alleging to be coming from some journalistic source. Okay, that's a news source. It could be a news story, like from the New York Times. That description that I gave is consistent with it being a real news story, right? So a news post is, to put it really bluntly, an actual news story shared online or one that's purporting to be such, okay? Call that a news post. Sharing the news post is just what you think it is. It's clicking the share button on the platform that you're on, or the equivalent button. First remark I want to make is that news post sharing is a communicative act. When we engage in it, we are engaging in an act of communication, a sort of quasi-speech act, if you will. And when we do that, when we share a news post, what I've defined as a news post online, we appear, I think, to be doing one or both of the following. So, be helpful to have an example. So take a news post that has Hillary Clinton says something like, Hillary Clinton involved in murder of state trooper. I picked that example because it is one that I have actually seen shared online when I was first looking at this, right? But you don't need examples. You can find one right now very easily online. Now this is not a real this is not a fact, right, that she was ever involved in that as far as I know, but it was alleged to be such by an organization that referred to itself as like the Denver Examiner, which is not an actual paper, okay? Just sounds like one. Sounds like one. Denver Examiner. Yeah, sure. I love their movie reviews. Right? Okay? So take something that I share. I share a link. It has this as a headline, and then it has, some stuff and a picture. Okay? So when I share, it looks as if what I'm doing is engaging in a communicative act that is doing one of both of the following. First, asserting, making a descriptive claim. For example, the descriptive claim that this, right? I'm asserting this. It looks like I'm asserting it. It also looks possibly like I'm maybe and/or doing something else. That is endorsing, engaging in a communicative act of endorsing. Engaging in a normative prescription, in other words. Something like, I'm saying everyone should read this. Right? Notice that I could do those independently. Right? I could assert this without endorsing that you read it. Although, depending on your account of assertion, that might be sort of weird. But it's possible. Or I could just be endorsing the story without necessarily asserting the headline. That is, I could be endorsing, like, you should read this, right? But not necessarily saying that it's true. Okay? But I could also be doing both. Because the thing about language and communication is it's very often the case that human beings do a lot of different things with words, as J.L. Alston said, at the same time. So I say to you, the food at that restaurant is really tasty. Well, I could be just seen as asserting something, that the food at the restaurant is tasty. But I could also, in a given context, like the context where we're trying to figure out where to go to eat for dinner, I could be seen as endorsing that as the place we should go. All right? And I could be doing both of those things. All right. Now, if I'm doing one or both of those things when I'm sharing news posts, then it seems, right, that I should be engaged in a certain kind of game. The game of giving and asking for reasons. That is, a game, a sort of practice, a language game, communication game. I use game sort of cheekily in the Wittgensteinian sense. The practice, we might say, that is subject to certain norms that are epistemic in nature. That is, the norms of testimony. They seem to be norms that call out for the appeals to evidence, subject to denials from other people. People can question me whether this is really true or not. So that all seems hopefully pretty clear so far. So far, all I've said is what it seems like we're doing online when we share news stories or fake news stories is that we're engaging in either acts of asserting or endorsement. And if we are, then we should be subject to the rules of evidence. That's the game we should be seeing ourselves as playing. But what if we're actually confused about what we're doing when we're sharing a news post? What if actually that's not the game we're playing? We just think we're playing that game. Okay? Well, in order to investigate that a little bit more closely, let's look at what we do and what we don't do when we're sharing information like this online. First thing, let's start with what we don't do. What we don't do is read what we're sharing. So, according to some recent studies, I'll mention one, the vast majority of us, all the studies agree, that the vast majority of people who share news, what I'm calling news posts online, do not read the stories that they're sharing. Again, none of us here. We all read them super closely, everything down to last word, and we read all the sources they cite before we consider very slowly and deliberatively whether to share this online, all of us here. But other people apparently do not. So a recent study, for example, out of researchers from Columbia University, studied not the site that I'm going to be talking most about. I haven't mentioned which site I'm mostly interested in. It's going to be Facebook in a little bit. I'll explain that. But for the moment, we can also talk about Twitter, and their work was done on Twitter. And one of the things they did was they studied, and the interesting thing about the study is not so much its result, which might be unsurprising to you, right? If you've ever spent time online, you might not be surprised that people don't actually read what they're sharing, but the methods that they engaged in to get to sort through the data. Essentially, what they did is they were able to take two massive data sets, a certain amount of shared posts, and then the reactions to those posts, the sort of the fact that a single knot on the node, point on the node was shared a story, and then they were able to sort through all the reshares, right, of that particular thing. One of the things, and also they were able to correlate with that, the amount of time that people spent clicking onto the site that was shared. Okay, so for the purposes of this study, reading a post meant clicking through to it, right? Not what the teachers in the room generally would consider reading, right? Clicking through to the link, not counting as reading the homework, right? But for purpose of this study, if you clicked through to it, right, you were good. Okay, so pretty low bar. So the results were that 60% of the people sharing posts did not read the posts they shared. Now, anecdotal evidence, speaking to, I was at an event at the National Press Club a year ago, and a senior Facebook executive who is in charge of their own internal studies on just this matter, right, said to a group where it was operating by rules that I was not allowed, I can say as much as I'm saying. So this is all anecdotal, and you don't have to believe me, but what this person said to us was that their own internal evidence showed that 90% did not read what they shared. And they were not going to share that data with the general public. You can figure out why they didn't feel. Their public explanation for that was because they're still working on it. But for them, reading counted as clicking through and spending a certain amount of seconds on so it was a little. It makes sense, right, that they had a higher bar for what counted as reading. You know, it's like 2 seconds on the page. I mean, so, right? Of course, nobody reads that stuff that much. Who reads that much? What we don't do, we don't read what we're sharing. Keep that in mind. So what do we do? Well, what we do, the psychologists are finding out, is that this is, again, no surprise to those of us who've actually been online. We share content that makes us angry and afraid. We also share other kinds of content that is emotionally laden. I share pictures of my kid. I share pictures of my cats. Many of you do as well. Those are nice and warm and fuzzy. They evoke warm and fuzzy feelings in myself and others. But we also, when we're sharing this sort of stuff, we're not generally sharing it for warm and fuzzy. The people who shared this were not feeling warm and fuzzy. Shocker. Right? They were feeling angry, and they wanted other people to feel angry. Indeed, the number one predictor of what will get a news post, what I define as a news post, shared online, is to include words that have strong moral content in the post. Murder is one. So, together, I think this makes it doubtful that the primary function of what I'm going to call the primary function of news post sharing is to engage in acts of assertive or endorsing testimony. Because what I just explained was, or what it seems likely, is that when we do this type of engage in this communicative act, we're not actually, it'd be hard to understand how we're recommending something to read that we haven't read ourselves. The food at that restaurant is tasty. Oh yeah? When did you go? Oh, I've never been. Well, why are you calling it tasty? Right? We're not actually engaging in, I mean, those two facts, at least, I'm not giving you an a priori argument. What I'm giving you is some evidence that strongly suggests that something is amiss with our self-understanding of what we're doing online in this type of act. I'm going to call the primary function of an act, of a communicative act, that which explains why that kind of act continues to persist. I'll repeat that. Primary function of an act is that which explains why that kind of act continues to persist. This is borrowed from my colleague Ruth Millican. She calls it the stabilizing function in her most recent work, but I'm going to call it the primary function. It's consistent with an act having a primary function, that is, let's say, x, for it to have other functions, y and z, right? The primary function of the communicative act is that which explains why that kind of act continues to exist. Compare. What is the primary function of yelling air ball at a basketball game? So somebody is trying to shoot a free throw, and then the people on the other who are for the other team chant air ball, air ball, air ball, right? The primary function, I hypothesize, is to distract the player. There are other functions as well, sort of like, to sort of hang out with one another. And if you're a basketball fan, we can dispute whether this is a primary. I can see some people already be like, wait a second, it's not why I do it. But we can dispute, run with the example. There are other ones. This is just an example. So let us imagine that the primary function is to distract. That's consistent with it having other functions as well, obviously. And we can also imagine that somebody new who's never been to a game before sort of drops in, hears people chanting air ball, and they think to themselves, oh, that's interesting. They're making a prediction. They're predicting that it will be an air ball, right? That person, according to my hypothesis, would be mistaken about the primary function, but you could see why they would be mistaken, because they think that there's one sort of act going on, but really the primary function, the reason that act persists is because of one fact, but they think the function is quite different. The example I gave is, you can think of your own examples, is pretty common in language, that there will be an act, a kind of act that we engage in, that has one explanation for why it actually persists, even though sometimes some users, people who engage in the act, may not realize themselves, A, that it has that primary function, or B, think that the primary function is something else. My hypothesis here that I've been building towards is that the primary function of the communicative act of news post sharing is expressive, not assertive, or a matter of normative endorsement. In many cases, when we engage in this sort of communicative act, we do so, I claim, in order to express a particular emotion or induce it in others. The particular emotion I think that is perhaps the most troubling is outrage. The neuroscientist Molly Crockett at Yale has been doing some excellent work on social media and outrage expression. One of the things that she's noted in her work, and I highly recommend you checking out, her name is Molly Crockett, is that people tend to become more outraged by a particular act that is described online, than shared online, reading about something online, than they would, or they do actually, become outraged. In other words, the degree of outrage they show to an act that they read about online is more than the outrage they experience when they see the same act right in front of them. So she studied this in a variety of different ways. And her studies all seem to point to the same conclusion. Now, she has some explanations. These are more, these are explanations, not this, her explanations, which I find are very interesting. Which is, she says, well, one reason you might think that is because outrage expression in real life is risky, right? If you're on the bus and you get mad at something that somebody said in the seat behind you, and you stand up and yell at them, things could happen. Things can escalate because you've just escalated, right? So violence can occur. It's risky. Not so much risky online. Not a lot of risk. Not a lot of risk to express outrage and actually feel that outrage. Her work actually is with people in fMRI machines, and she's studying what happens to the brain when we read these sorts of posts. So she says, you know, if outrage is the fire, then social media is the gasoline. It increases outrage. I think this is particularly noticeable on Facebook, but also on Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter, a variety of other platforms. But Facebook is particularly interesting to me because, remember, my hypothesis is the primary function of engaging in acts like this, the primary function, not the only thing we're doing, but the thing that explains why it continues to persist is expressive. And I just gave an example of the sort of emotion that we tend to express. Not the only one, but one that's particularly troubling. Notice that's particularly, I think this hypothesis is particularly compelling when we look at the most important, that is the most used by far, social media platform, which is Facebook, where we're encouraged to react and communicate by, particularly react to posts like this, by emojis. All right? So for those of you who know Facebook, you know that when your friend shares a news story, whether it's like this or just a story from the New York Times, underneath the story, you'll find your choices of emojis or emoticons, right? There's happy face, sad face, Edvard Munch face, right? And so forth. And again, there are parallels on other platforms. So, you know, we can talk other platforms if you like, but I'm interested in Facebook because that's the one which is the most important platform, because it's the one that's most used worldwide by far. So, notice that platform explicitly encourages our reactions to be expressive. Their slogan is, we connect you. And what they mean is not we connect you intellectually, they mean emotionally. And that's not a bad thing. Emotional connection is awesome. But just reflect, for those of you who've used the platform, reflect on what happens when you use those emojis or emoticons. First of all, you probably use those buttons first. You probably decide which one of those you're going to pick. And if you're like me, you feel a subtle normative pressure from those who have picked other things before you. If you have a post that comes down be honest with yourselves now. You have a post come down your feed, whether it's Facebook or another platform that functions in a similar way. Not all do. You will probably feel some pressure to react to the feed in a way that is consistent with the emotions that others have expressed. If somebody is sharing a feed and everybody is like sad-faced, and you're like, ha-ha! Right? That would seem odd. You would realize you are making an emotionally strong, salient statement there. You're expressing something that's different from what the tribe is expressing. The other thing to note is that it seems to prime you in terms of your comments. If you do go comment on it, if I were to express outrage face to this, and then later comment on, you know, I'm not sure the author is actually really completely getting the full facts. That would be weird. Emotional expression not consistent with later content. Not impossible, but interesting. What does, again, that suggest? It suggests to me that really often what we're doing when we're sharing content online is not anything having to do with assertion or endorsement, but an expressive act. A few remarks and then I'll wrap this up. The first thing I want to note is the hypothesis that I've just made is consistent with us also doing other things with our communicative acts of news post sharing. Like a shout of air ball in a basketball game, just as it can be a prediction, could be a prediction, news post sharing can also be an assertion or endorsement. So it could be that somebody who posts a headline like this in the story could be asserting it. They could be endorsing the story. What I'm claiming is that's not that fact that they're doing so is not what explains the persistence of this kind of act. I also would note that expressive acts can also induce belief. So I'm not denying that an expressive act like this can induce belief. In fact, expressive acts are really often very good at inducing belief. That's why people in the propaganda business use expression and moral expression. I mean moral emotions, rather, in their propaganda. I mean, compare propaganda speech, for example, to that expressed, the kind of speech that is often expressed to soldiers in boot camp about, if it's a time of war, about the enemy. Or even the sort of, just simply getting people to, in boot camp or in other sports teams, to chant along with one another. What does that expression do? Those acts of expression, they increase tribal bonding, but they also can cause certain beliefs, like the belief that we're really good, we're the best, those people not so good, we're going to beat them. Right? Those are beliefs. Okay. So, back to our two questions. Why does information pollution, particularly fake news of the kind, old-fashioned kind that I talked about, why does it spread so effectively on social media? Well, for all the reasons the usual explanations give, but also because expressions of emotions, according to my hypothesis, particularly moral emotions, are highly predictive of sharing and attention. So expressions of emotions are, as I indicated, there's lots of data on this, are highly predictive of more shares. If you want to get somebody to share something, have moral emotions in them. Why is that? Well, you might say that's because, human psychology is hardwired to be attracted to concepts like that. And that's part of the story. But that would not be the whole story. The reason that these sorts of strong moral emotion terms are also highly predictive of news post sharing is because of the way the economy of social media works. Social media platforms, all more or less, roughly speaking, and I know there's experts in the room, but roughly speaking, the economy of those platforms works in a similar way. What matters is getting eyeballs on posts. The amount of people that pay attention to your platform at any given time is directly correlated with how much money you're going to make off that platform. And the reason is because, as we know, or hopefully you know, that the social media platforms that we all use and enjoy, or many of us here do, make their money by essentially selling our information. They make some of their money from advertising, but that advertising is targeted and personalized. How is it targeted and personalized? Why is it that just the shoes that you were thinking about buying keep reappearing on your feeds or on your New York Times page? Or even shoes that are better than the ones that you thought you were buying. You look for some shoes, and you're like, yeah, they seem okay. And then later, some really cool shoes that are just what you're looking for turn up online. Why is that? On the places that you're looking? Because the information that we are sharing, whether we like it or not, with companies that run the digital platforms that we use and enjoy, that information is being used in order to predict the sorts of things that we will pay attention to next time that we're online. And one of the things that is very useful for the algorithms to track is the amount of emotions, I'm claiming, that people are expressing or feeling induced in when they're engaging with these platforms online. So it's not just, according to my hypothesis, that social media is an effective tool for spreading fake news because A, we're gullible, that's true, we are gullible, or B, the information polluters are very, very good at their job, that's also true, but because those platforms are developed to help us express and receive emotions. That's how the economics of those platforms functions. And no one, I think, in Silicon Valley would deny that. That's just the way it is. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, he doesn't dance around the fact that he's trying to emotionally connect people. So it shouldn't be too surprising that emotionally contentful pieces of information are going to be highly shared and salient to the algorithms that are responsible for the sharing and the arrival of information in our feeds. Second question was, why are reasons and facts seemingly so ineffective in combating such pollution? Well, because, as I've just been arguing, we aren't primarily engaged in the game of giving and asking for facts, for reasons online. That's not what we're doing when we're engaging in this kind of communicative act. It just looks like it. It looks to us, and we pretend that what we're doing is giving reasons. Look, people, there is a study you must look at that confirms our political views. Check it out. Looks like we're sharing information. Sometimes we may actually sincerely be doing that. All of you here, of course. But I've been claiming we're actually playing a different game. And if we don't know which game we're playing, if we don't know that we're not actually engaging in the game of giving and asking for reasons, that very fact can make us particularly susceptible to people who do know what game we're playing. Because if it turns out that the game we're playing operates by the rules not of the seminar room, the courtroom, but the rules of the water cooler and the playground, if that's the game we're playing, then the person who knows which game we're really playing, well, to them, the rest of us will look like easy marks. Thank you. Should I just field my...
Sure. Oh.
Yes, in the back.
Oh, I don't know if this works. Does this work? You can hear me?
I can certainly hear you.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure about the whole, it felt like there was sort of a gap in the explanation because it for a couple things.
Sure.
One was, if you're talking about the QAnon thing that you're describing,
I was talking about Pizzagate.
Pizzagate, but
yeah.
didn't that start with
QAnon
QAnon?
would certainly would
Oh
work
no!
there.
Oh, Pizzagate was different than that. Okay, okay. So there's that, and then also sort of I suppose you could say the sort of cause of decisions that people have later, that's sort of results from these particular events. Like there seems like, first of all, there's a whole taxonomy of different types of results. Like one would be the Pizzagate kind of person, and then one would be just sort of a little bit like how someone's primed to choose like cereal in the grocery store. It's like there's just like a whole spectrum of effects.
Yes.
Some of them don't seem to be quite just the result of emotion, but much more I don't know, it's like you're giving people some kind of heuristic eventually, and then they're acting on the basis of that heuristic. And so the emotions clearly maybe attract interest, but it seems like there's a lot of other stuff between the emotion and the action that people are prompting, and then there's like this range of...
I couldn't agree more. I think that seems quite right. So all I was claiming today was that the communicative act of this news post sharing, right? That it's the reason it continues to exist and be so prevalent online. Its primary function, what function it's serving, is to express emotion. But as I was hinting at the end, that expression, that acts of expression like this, can be particularly good at also causing people to change their beliefs, and can be used as heuristics as well. I mean, that can also be the case as a shorthand for various things. Shorthand, for example, a sort of general political view, right? So it can be that, for example, that in offline communication, we often engage in jokes for political jokes, or jokes made at political exponents' expense around a water cooler or in the office, right? are a way of inducing emotion, of a certain sort, laughter, but also serve a purpose, right? They often can be a shorthand for communicating to somebody that what your political views are. The fact that you make this joke about Trump, for example, in my case, right, would be a shorthand of communicating to somebody, look, which tribe I belong to. So by claiming that the primary function of these actions, of these types of communicative acts, these particular communicative acts, is an expressive one, I'm not denying first that those acts can do different things, as I said, like asserting, right, and so forth. And I'm also not denying that they can't have various downstream effects that are quite rich and have descriptive content. So I take myself to, if I understood you correctly, to be agreeing with what you were saying.
I was just curious about how all those things get filled in, but maybe you don't have to count that.
Well, you're right. Me too. I'm curious about that too. I mean, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Some of which I've done, and some of which I haven't, and I don't think has been done on how those things get filled in. What I'm trying to do today is to just note that one thing that I think hasn't been noticed before, or at least not sufficiently made clear to people, in my view, is that this common perception that what's going on when we're sharing news stories online is like sharing facts to each other, and the only problem is that sometimes we don't know what the facts are, right? That is true. We often don't know what the facts are. That's not the only issue. The issue is that we're often confused, I'm claiming, about what it is sort of acts that we're actually engaging in. And without knowing that, I think sometimes that can lead to bad effects downstream. But I agree with you that there's got to be a lot of work about how all the various parts of my quick talk today would fit up together. And, luckily, the job security, there's more work to be done. Maria?
Oh, okay, so that was a bit of a follow-up to. I felt exactly the same thing because and I wonder if it has a little bit to do with your sort of Millican machinery, right?
Yeah.
Because you're doing one primary function.
Yes.
And it seems that I think you're right that the gossip effect in the sharing, but of course we might gossip at the water cooler to bond and have emotional thing, but the person we gossip about is still going to be harmed.
Absolutely.
Even though our primary function here might be to bond or have some emotional exchange.
Yes.
And this is very much the case here in these
Yes.
these
Yes.
stories, which I think is what Lisa is getting at also, right? That the people that seed these stories, their purpose is not the gossip. Their purpose is
I see.
related to the content,
Well,
right? So you have multiple purposes that ride on each other, but if you don't, so like you could do, one, like that things in evolution are stabilized because of one primary function, which is Millikan's machinery. Or you could have a more sort of negative constraint causality, that whatever will flow through this path because of the many constraints is going to work, right? And be maintained and stabilized, right? And I think that sort of ecology would be better at explaining the sort of multiple diverging and overlapping purposes right, that's going on in this.
So I agree with you that, in fact, I'm excited with your thought. I mean, I'm not sure I'm convinced that we need, I like the Millican, I mean, she's my colleague and friend, so I like her a lot, and I also think her work is really, really rich on this, on the ecology of language. But, that could be technical disagreements between us. I do want to pick up on one thing that you said that I got really excited about because I think is super, super important. And if I missed that in the response to the previous question, I apologize. So you're absolutely right that the people who are engaging in creating fake news stories, as I was trying to say, the information polluters at the end, their goal is not their goal, their explicit goal, and they have an explicit goal if they're people. I mean, some of the content that's generated is actually generated by an algorithm, so the people
That's
are
generated
even.
by people.
But that's generated by people, right? Exactly. Well, or by another algorithm, but eventually we get back to somebody who's a person, I hope. And when we do, that person's intention is clearly not expressive or primarily expressive. That person's goal is actually to manipulate and deceive for, as I said, fun, profit, and political gain. that actually is, that point is crucial in order for me. And it was what I ended with, actually. Because for me, the importance of the analysis that I'm engaging in is partly to sort of explain why it is that these intentionally created deceptions work so effectively. And part of what I'm hypothesizing is they work very effectively because, look, well, just back up a little bit and think about cons in general. Just cons, right? Cons often work because the person doing the con knows certain things that the people who are the subject of the con don't know. And one of the things that they may know is certain facts about, like, that they may convince the subject of the con, yes, to that one thing's happening when actually they know something else is happening. And that is when we are particularly vulnerable. When we think we're totally confident that of this particular situation, and that's when we're very vulnerable, and they know that. So what I'm claiming is that the fact that the primary function of this communicative act, the reason these things exist, or that this type of act it persists as much as it does online, is that it is the expression of emotion, is consistent with the fact that other people might use those acts for different reasons, right? Not to express emotion, right? Because they're taking advantage of the fact that it's because it's the primary function of it to express emotion that allows people who are aware of that fact to actually game the system. So, when Ruth, for example, talks about the primary function or a stabilizing function, she's very clear that same sentence, for example, a sentence or type of sentence, could be used quite differently by different people if the context changes. And that can often be extremely useful for all sorts of reasons. For irony, for example, like, engagement. Irony requires some sort of gaming the system in a way, right? In a lesser extent, sarcasm. But, so yeah, I got really excited when you said that because that allowed me to try to, and so I hope that's speaking to your point. I mean, I agree that there are other ways of trying to explain that fact than the one I'm giving now. I guess one thing I'm trying to convince people of is that, like, if there's anything that I'm trying to convince people of in this talk that I would love for people to take away, no matter whether they agree with my particular of my communicative analysis, is just that we need, as philosophers and as people working on the science of information, we need to pay attention to the possibility that the public, and when we're using, and that includes us, when we're using social media, that we may be engaged in acts that are different than what we think they are. And that's important to know. Thank you. That was a great question.
So I want to pick up on that. So I take it your project is, one of raising self-consciousness, as it were. So we think we're playing a game, but there's actually another game going on. And if we learn that this other game is going on, we'll be less vulnerable.
That would be the hope, yeah.
I guess my question to you is, if we learned we were playing this other game, we being, the public at large.
The people outside of this room.
Yeah.
Who are not
I guess my question is, would we be less vulnerable? I guess I don't know if I have a view one way or the other. It very well could be that we wouldn't be less vulnerable, which is
it is
perhaps a scary thought.
The thought, yes,
so
indeed.
I just wanted your thought.
Yeah, good. The thought that you just raised, that we could become aware of, more self-aware of what sort of acts we're engaging in, and still be extremely vulnerable to the manipulations of information polluters. Yes, that is a thought that haunts one's dreams, right, and nightmares. And, that could be. I mean, notice for the philosophers in the room, the sort of point that I'm making here is familiar, obviously, from the history of philosophy. Philosophers, for example, such as David Hume, thought that all normative language, that we were, as I'm claiming we are to our communicative acts of news post sharing, Hume roughly thought that we were in the same situation with regard to all, basically, acts of normative expression. Well, they were expression, right? Expressivism is sort of predicated on the idea that we're fundamentally mistaken most of the time. Not all of us. Some of us are not, but most of us are mistaken about what we're doing when we're saying things are right or wrong. Open question, right, which has been discussed, right, is suppose everybody became convinced of expressivism. What would happen then? Well, I'm not sure, but I would say this. If you want to see how expressivism, whether we're aware of it or not, is correct, whether we're aware of it or not, if you want to see how expressivism actually would play out in a laboratory, then go on Facebook. So, that's what happens when expressivism runs rampant, when we're not aware. When we are aware, maybe things wouldn't change. Maybe it would just be that, well...
Quasi-realism.
Yeah, we're quasi-realists. I guess we'd have to talk to Simon Blackburn and find out, right? Maybe we all have to become deflationists about truth. I'm not going to do that, so... anyway, give it back to the FD. Yeah, Don.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm always worried about when we talk about internet culture is whether we're being ahistorical about these things. And so I wonder if you think that this is a distinctly different problem today than, say, before the inventing of the printing press, when people shared stories and it was all gossip and they didn't have truth claims they didn't have the capacity to determine the truth claims. I think for me what's really changed is that the Enlightenment culture of critical discourse, for those of us who buy into it, forces us to at least try to demonstrate that we have investigated the truth claims of the stories that we share. But even in academia, every time I write a paper, I see confirmation bias in my active research because the amount of research is so voluminous that we could prove anything we want if you just pay attention in the appropriate way. So I think this is a far more ubiquitous problem than just something that's occurred with internet culture.
Oh, well, yes. That seems right to me. I'm not going to quibble with that. I mean, I've written a bunch about that. I mean, it seems, I don't think it's, deceit has been around as long as there's been any human beings. Mm-hmm. Emotional expression has been around as long as there's been human beings. And propaganda has been around almost as long as that. So, to one extent, in one case, we could say, well, what much, what's changed? Not the fact that sometimes we're communicating. It's also what's next changed, I should add, is that as we were just talking about, the fact that we may be confused sometimes about what it is we're doing in language. Mm-hmm. So that's not changed either. Today wasn't talking about what's changed, right? I was talking about those two questions, mm-hmm. right? But I am interested in what's changed, and I think a lot has changed with regard to not the facts that I just conceded don't change. I mean, that's right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think you're onto something when you said that I interpreted you as saying is that it has to do with the role that certain epistemic norms play in or don't play in our culture right now. Mm-hmm. And in relation to the talk that I just gave, that comes out when you think about the fact that, it's not an accident that these news stories are fake news stories, that the stories that I'm talking about are parasitic on a set of norms that are both visual and in one sense, right? How a news story looks, the Denver Examiner, right? What the names are like, but also certain epistemic norms about what we're doing when we recommend a piece of information from a journalistic source, what we can expect, what sorts of norms are appropriate, how much trust we should place in that. Those are all norms that have been in place, and of course have been, as many of the rest of you would say, there's a long history of violating those norms, right? Talk to any early American historian of information, some of my colleagues in the University of Connecticut, and they'll regale you in tales of how corrupt our behavior with regard to some of those norms have been throughout the history.
Alexander Hamilton was a hermaphrodite.
Well, right.
Apparently.
So exactly. So yeah, in fact, just go to Hamilton, the play, and you'll learn quite a bit. It's filled with all sorts of examples like that. And so that's not new either. But what is new is the way that these particular platforms are integrated into the fabric of our life. That's new. The book that I wrote called The Internet of Us is meant to suggest, that title is meant to suggest that, that the Internet of Things is really, we're one of the things now. And one reason for that, not the only reason, is because the social media platforms that we use have become a ubiquitous feature of many, many, many of our lives. And that intimacy brings many interesting things, but it also brings, like intimacy does, vulnerability. So our vulnerability to certain sorts of transgressions of various epistemic norms has, I think, become heightened. You might say, well, is that new and different in kind or just in scale? And I'd want to say at that point, well, there's a point at which differences in scale become relevant differences in kind. And we should, in a certain point, one should stop worrying, right? Not that you were, but I would say, well, at that point, we should stop worrying about how different it is and just realize, ruh-roh. Okay? and that's, that's perhaps not the most philosophically technical way of expressing the point of this talk, but there it is.
There you go, Chris.
I want to ask a little bit about the notion of expression. I'm worried it's a little too capacious. So one thing you might be doing when you expressed, you said, is expressing your own emotion.
Yep.
Another is to try and get somebody else to share that emotion. Another might be, on the expressivist account of normativity, endorsement, which was supposedly a different kind of character of communicative act. Another that you indicated at various points might be suturing tribal bonds, right? So this is basically the same thing as grooming behavior in primates, right? So I mean, I'm worried that the category of an expressive act becomes overly general and sucks up a lot of interestingly different typological communicative activity.
That could be. So what I was claiming is that an act is expressive when it's an expression of emotion.
You also said, and intending to get somebody else to share that emotion.
No, that's right. And often it's done with the intention of also getting people to induce emotion in others. And so that's a helpful comment, because you're right. I sometimes use those phrases together, and I was collapsing my sort of definition of expression with one of its effects. And so an effect that the person could intend to have in expressing the emotion could be to some of the effects I mentioned were to induce belief, right? To get you to share the emotion, to signal to others, right? Signaling behavior. Those are all effects. Those aren't, that's not what makes the action expressive on my account. They're the effects of the expression. And you're right that I think during the talk I was sometimes too quickly in my excitement to explain the view, collapsing those together. But in the work in the actual chapter that I'm talking about, I try to distinguish the effects of an expressive act and the act itself. Now you're right. It could be that.
My original worry was that you might try and get somebody to share your emotion without using your own subjective expression of emotion.
You might, but
I mean,
what? But I'm.
This is
yeah.
right here, right? That would be an expressive act by the nefarious actor.
So that I don't see. That seems
You're
right.
trying to induce an emotion.
Hold on.
Sorry.
That seems right. That I can induce emotion in people without expressing emotion.
Yeah.
But what I was saying is that there are communicative acts that their primary function is expressive, whereby I'm defining that as an expressive act is one that expresses an emotion, right? That's what it does. And what I was claiming is that those acts have certain results, certain effects, right? I wasn't denying that you could also have those same, I mean, of course you can, think about induced belief. Is expressing emotion the only way I can induce belief in others? Let's hope not, right? I mean, it might be a particularly effective way, but let's hope not. So, I mean, so you understand the distinction I'm making. Yeah, okay, good.
Great. First, this isn't working, so I'm not going to hold it against my. Oh, it is
It
working?
is, it's recording,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. It didn't sound like it's working. Then I'll continue. I thought people were just doing a charade. I thought.
Yes.
I thought the talk was a very useful template to think about this stuff, so I want to thank you for that. I also just want to push the line that's been coming out, two different aspects. One is that expressivism is a lot more pervasive altogether, so it's not clear how special it is to the online stuff. And the other is that the notion of expressivism, making it distinct from epistemic functions, it's blurry. I mean, I think both of these you acknowledge, but I just wonder if they can't be, if they're not more of a problem. In terms of the expressivism stuff, it seems to me that most of our communication that seems to be assertive, or anything other than the really trivial practical things like, the salt is in the left hand part of the table.
Right.
Well, to a large extent expressive, I've found, that could just be because of my bad personality, but very often when I treat people's assertions as if they're asserting something and therefore I have a right to ask for their reasons for believing it, they get angry at me. Like, what did you think it's like I didn't actually mean to assert it, or now maybe they just don't want to bother arguing over it, but it seems like they act as if I'm misinterpreting what was going on. They said this fact because they want to express something, and it seems to me it's pervasive, and one indication of how pervasive it is when you use examples, you said the schoolyard and the water cooler is what we're really doing, rather than these rather esoteric situations, the seminar room, which some people are never in their entire lives, or the courtroom, which is a rather special thing. And even in the courtroom and the seminar room, I wonder how much of what's going on is really a search for truth, giving reasons.
Those are open questions, and these are good points that you're making. I mean, it's certainly the case that, if Simon was here, for example, or any number of other, and some of you may be, card-carrying expressivists, right, non-cognitivists about norms, you'll be like, well, yeah, just one more example of the sort of, fact that we've been trying to convince people of in a long time. Now, for myself, one way to sort of come into this talk, if I had a different set of philosophical views than I do, so I'm not an expressivist about normative language, right? Or if I am, so that's a different set of talks and books and stuff, right? My own views about that. But for present purposes, just say I don't have that view, okay? So for me, it's sort of I have a sort of contrast class, right? But even if we don't, even if you are an expressivist, really what I'm saying is, well, I don't mind saying to people who want to give it expressivist accounts of a lot of the rest of what we're engaging in, I'll just say, well, yeah, here's another example. And this one seemed particularly helpful for us now in trying to understand the two questions that I started out. Why does fake news spread so quickly on the internet, or effectively, as I put it? And secondly, why are reasons and facts not particularly helpful in combating it? And the expressivist hypothesis is helpful for answering that second question especially, but also the first one. So that's why, so I agree. I mean, there's lots of other things to talk about, like where else do we engage in this, in expression? You don't have to be expressivist to think, as you just did, that all over the place.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not an expressivist.
my colleague Dorit Baran, she has a view that a lot of basic human communication has evolved because of its expressive purpose. And if you think that, then you think it's like baked in to our communication right from the get-go. And I think that's pretty, I'm not completely, she's persuading me, I guess. I guess I'm starting to drink the complete Yukon Kool-Aid,
Thank you.
So what I want to talk about is not necessarily the semantic issues about the words you use to kind of describe this phenomenon that's going on.
Yep.
However, I just want to say I 100% agree that emotion is the foundation of what is going on here. Just talking about like these posts being shared, not really looking at their source because that's politics, that's money, the source is different than what it's trying to do. The purpose of this headline is to be as sensationalist as possible to get people to interact with it emotionally. That's its purpose. So to deny that there's any emotion not involved in interacting with this, it's asinine. It doesn't make sense. If I look at a source, I'm like, I have to check, where is this source? Well, I can only spread good content. I can't be spreading quote unquote fake news or alternative facts because I'm just like,
Good.
That's what people should be doing. However, I can just be overestimating my ability to fact check. I could be overestimating my ability to interact deeply with something that I'm looking at on the train for 3 minutes.
Right.
That's why I just choose not to engage at all. But people that do engage, if you think you have a good source, the emotional drive is I need people to see this, to see this is a good news source. This is not fake news. There's emotion behind that saying the political climate is not settled enough to intellectually look at something completely. So there's no lack of emotion in any sort of even in good news sources solar panels everywhere all over the Sahara Desert. That's obviously not true. But if you see that, you're like, I would like that to be true.
Right.
So the emotions do not only dwell in the outrageous kind of
Great example.
spectrum. It's any sort of good feeling, any free shot of dopamine in your little news feed can be marketed.
That's, by the way, what this neuroscientist, Molly Crockett, that's one of the things she studies.
Exactly.
Is the amount of dopamine that gets activated, as spreads, washes through our cognitive economy, our neurobiological economy, when we're engaging with things online.
And not only, though, is that sharing, but if you share a news source and people start interacting with, you get a notification that oh, the so-and-so liked my post.
Yeah.
So-and-so liked my news source. That's already more validation coming in saying,
an emotional validation.
You are a good person.
Yeah.
You have good ideas. And that's just free crack.
Yay, you. I think it's actually more primitive. It's not just like, you're good. That's how we'll interpret it.
Yeah.
It really is just, yay, you. You go. You go. Right? And or boo. I mean, this is like the expressivist analysis that we need here for this is not sophisticated, quasi-realism. It's old-fashioned emotivism, right? It's old-fashioned, that's yay and boo. That's what we're doing online. I agree with you about that. And that was a great comment. I think that you're right. Of course, we're sort of mutual admiration club. Yay you. Yay you. Yay your comment. But you're right that a lot of what's going on as well is this we want, right? We are, emotions prime us to set us up for confirmation bias, right? Confirmation bias is not just this simple. We often describe it as the propensity that human beings have to believe propositions that are already coherent, epistemically coherent with other propositions they already believe, right? And put that way, it's sort of like a fact about one's cognitive abilities and the fact about the subject's epistemic system. But really, at the end of the day, the reason we're susceptible to that in a particular given case is often because of the emotions that we're experiencing at that moment. And people who, some of you may do this, maybe training to do this, some of you may do this for a living. If you're a person that manages content for a site, that is pushes content, social media on a social media platform, either for your own website or your own profile, or because you work for a company that employs you to do that, you're going to be using emotions to get people to click through. The social media platforms, of course, just want the clicks. They just want you to click through because that's what's, for them, the measure of attention that they need in order to sell the information and hire prices than they already are. They want to have the click, and they want to have the data trail that got you from that click, and will be allow them to predict what future clicks you may engage in the future. And really, the grease for those wheels is emotion. Yeah.
So the claim that the expressive goal is the primary function of the sharing activity, that seems right. But in the talk, you also seem to be open to the idea that it could also be an assertive act as well.
Yeah.
And that there seems to be some evidence for that. People come away with that the belief that the headline is true and so forth. But if part of what you're trying to do is to explain why we're not subject to facts and reasons that doesn't correct us, then it's, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it seems like then you sort of have to go full expressivist and say it doesn't have the assertive role, because if it's got the assertive role, even if that's not the primary function, it seems like those norms are still in effect, that I should be able to ask you, why do you think that? What is your evidence for it? Here's some evidence against that. You should change your view. So it seems like it's not enough just to say that's the primary function. It needs to be the only function if it's going to, at least if it's going to answer that question.
Yeah,
about why.
that's a great question. I think that connects with the first question that was asked, because it's a question about the connection between some of the claims that it was making. So let me try to give you a more full-fledged answer to that. So the first thing I'm going to confess is I'm split between, so I've been thinking about this question quite a bit, this sort of further, the relationship between epistemic norms and the primary function of communicative acts in general. So in this particular case, I'm split between two answers to your question, and I haven't decided what they are yet, and you're pushing me in one direction, but it's not the only direction to go. So the one answer is to say, well, what we should say is that the primary function is expressive, but so what that means is that the explanation for why that kind of act persists is because it expresses emotion. That's consistent with the fact that individuals in particular contexts may also be asserting, or only asserting, actually, right? In fact, it could be, right, that's consistent with that claim. So that would be like the fact that, occasionally people go to the basketball game and don't understand the shouts, right? They take them or even engage in them with a different goal, all right? But that doesn't really matter much because it's a pretty strange case, right? It happens, but yeah, it doesn't really change the ecology as we were talking about. In that case, then the norms that we should be looking at, right, are not the norms that govern rules of testimony, because if we're trying to explain in general what the norms that are operative in a community that are going to be the governing norms of a practice are going to respond to the purposes of the practice. We can debate that, but I'm asserting that as a premise, right? So that's the one way to go, right, is to say, well, the reason that epistemic norms are not operative here is because the primary function is what it is, understanding that that's consistent with occasionally people also engage in acts of assertion. Cost of that explanation, of course, is that the cost is that what I have to say is that I have to, and this is a empirical question, is that most of the behavior, the reasons this persists, not the ideas that are going on in people's heads, but the reason it persists is because of that expression. Now, I gave you some evidence for that. I tried to give some evidence, some empirical evidence. Not definitive. I'm not going to be able to give you there's no such there's not in the land of a priori arguments, right? And that's, you could question that. You could say, as you said, well, but look, people do believe things. They come away believing this crap. Now notice what I said later on in the talk. Remember at the very end, I was like, without really making a big deal of it, I was considering objections. And one of the objections was, well, doesn't it induce belief? And I was like, but expressive acts do induce belief. And I gave my little example of the boot camp and those sorts of things, right? So I was trying to respond to just that worry. Okay, so in a sense, that was the official talk, right? And that was the response I was trying to give to your objection. However, there is another possibility, which was not what I said, but maybe what I should have said. I don't know yet. The other possibility is to say, actually, even though the primary function is expressive, assertion actually happens all the time, at the same time. It just is sort of like a communicative free rider. Okay? That too would not be surprising from the standpoint of actual human communication, right? We do things like that all the time. A lot of our acts, like this restaurant's food is tasty, are often just we're saying a lot of different things. We're doing a lot of different things, rather. Excuse me. So if that's true, then your point becomes back on the table. So what do I do then? Well, then I have to go back to that earlier premise that I also used in my that I was implicitly assuming during the talk, which is that the norms that are operative or governing on a particular practice are going to be the norms that are connected to the goal or purpose of the practice itself. Where by the goal of the purpose, I mean the primary function in this context. Okay? So I think that might also allow you to go with the second reading. Okay? The reason that seems plausible in this case is just for the, again, a lot hinges in both of my responses that you've agreed that this is the primary function. If you don't think it's a primary function, then, well, we wouldn't even be having this discussion right now. But you started off seeming to conceive that. So what I have to show is that the primary function has an important role to play of communicative acts, has an important role. And that's not, in a sense, too surprising. I mean, if the primary, for a lot of our communicative acts that are assertions, what is the primary, why do they persist? Well, the common story is to pass information back and forth, right? I mean, why do we engage in insertion, right? To give each other information. That's one story, right? Why do we do that? Because we need to know stuff, right? Do you get it? We're a social creature. We can't all know everything. So I need to know things about what's happening on the other side of the hill. You've been on the other side of the hill, so you tell me stuff so I don't get eaten by the bear that's on the other side of the hill, et cetera, right? That seems plausible, right? Scale that up to a social, the primary function of assertion is to convey relevant information to us. That is to express, not to express, but to assert is to present as true, right? To present some information as true for the purposes that I just got. Now, if that's the primary function for assertion, then we'd expect that the operative governing norms would be epistemic. Different primary function, different set of norms. Okay? So I think I'm covered either way, but I agree it's a subtle question for which, well, job security.
Can I ask you a question too?
Sure.
So to go back to the neuroscience language for a minute, but just in order to make a point, when there's outrage in interpersonal context, like on the bus that you were mentioning, then an expression of outrage is usually accompanied by a spike in cortisol because it's stressful.
Right.
And the communication of outrage on social media platforms is accompanied by a spike in dopamine because it's pleasurable. That's a striking difference and suggests that it's sort of a externalizing of the costs, as it were, of being outraged. So there's something about it being stressful and scary to be outraged on the bus that, as you said, checks the degree and frequency in which we get outraged on the bus. And on the other hand, when you sort of engage in a huge-scale human experiment to make outrage a lot cheaper, it seems to have the potential to condition people to be more outraged on
Yeah.
a regular basis.
Great comment. And this is the point you just made about sort of what's happening to us chemically during different cases of outrage, depending on the context, online or off, is indeed what Crockett is on about. That's very much that's that very fact is what she's appealing to, right, in her studies to make the explanation. And I think you and her are right that, I mean, I think she doesn't go as far as you just did. She's trying to be cautious as as a good scientist,
Right.
But not saying
don't
you're
have
not
that-
being cautious, but
we don't have
we're
that problem.
philosophers here. You don't have those issues, right? But yeah, I think you're right that one of the real dangers is the possibility that we are being conditioned to be outraged, and that's one of the things that I'm in this new book, this new project. I'm really concerned about. In this book, I am going to be claiming that what's happening online is just sort of one step towards or one part or one element of a society of increasing society of outrage and globalization and marketing of that experience, and it's very dangerous for democracy.
Oh, gotcha. So I think you know what, famous last words.
You think that the future this could create is dangerous for democracy? Those were your most recent words. You're Mark Zuckerberg. Just put yourself in his position. You have
Excellent.
You have control of this huge scale human experiment. Is its structure so unconditionally pointed towards this conditioning that there's nothing you can change, that you just have to abandon the project and face exile from Silicon Valley in order to help us do the right thing and stay away from the insanity? Or what
Right.
can you change
Right.
from
Well,
this? Because it's over 1 billion people. It's causing riots.
Right.
It's causing violence.
That's a brilliant practical question. It's a shame we're out of time. But okay, quick answer. Part anecdote. So I used to think that what we could change would be we could change how, one thing we could change is we could change on Facebook in particular how we're conditioned to react to the news posts like this. Now they have experimented with that themselves, so this is not completely out of the blue. Make a long story short and sort of, so I was fortunate enough at one point a couple years ago, actually about a year and a half ago, to have dinner with some executives from Silicon Valley, including one from this particular platform, and not Mark Zuckerberg, people lower down. But we had dinner and drinks, and at one point I made my suggestion, and it went like this. And I was sincere about it at the time. I said, what if we changed it from the emoticons and we had it as warranted by the evidence, not warranted by the evidence, and need more information? Those were the three choices you could make. And perhaps not surprisingly, their reaction to it was similar to yours. They thought that was the funniest thing that anybody said. It was sort of like this. Actually, I'm not really exaggerating. They were laughing about it, and then later somebody else would come in there and they'd be like, say it again, right? They thought it was hilarious that I made it. They were like, oh, you're so cute, you little philosopher. And I've now realized that I mean, it is funny. Because especially after now that I'm thinking this way, right? I think this goes back to your dark nightmare. Really, what would my present hypothesis predict? What would it predict is that for a little bit of time, maybe these buttons would actually start to make people, is it justified? What does that mean? Even evidence, that sort of thing. It would maybe work, right, for a little bit, but then pretty quickly I would predict that justified by the evidence, warranted by the evidence, would become functionally, yay this. Right? Pretty quickly. It would be, yay this, yay that, and, just neutral. I'm chill. That would be the three emotional options. So I think the real answer to this question, and I can't give, I mean, luckily we are heading out of time, but my suggestion is not that everything is, I don't think we're too far deep into this just to like completely pull the plug, I suspect, from an economic perspective. But what I think we do need to start doing is becoming more, making the public more aware of how the economy of the internet actually functions. It's not going to solve everything, but self-awareness is actually a good thing. I leave you with that.